Thanks for joining us, Steve.
Thanks, Bob.
You know, we talked a little last week of you were on the front lines of a historic event, I'm sure a frustrating, exhausting event. You've had time to now reflect now outside of government. What are your personal and professional kind of observations about COVID?
Yeah, for me, two major observations that have stuck with me. One was the power and the importance of the private sector in cooperation with academia and government. I mean, you think about the identification of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the genome, and then basically the authorization of 2 vaccines 10 months later. It's a remarkable event, and if we hadn't had the cooperation of government, science, academia, industry, we wouldn't be where we are, I think, today even. So it really struck me that the vibrant private sector, certainly in cooperation and collaboration with government, was a really important part of this. The second thing was, during the time of the vaccine development, we spent a lot of time reaching out to folks to really discuss how vaccines are developed. So a lot of interest in the science and the development. But what really struck me was that those who were the most marginalized in society, those who had the least access to care, were the least trustful of the process of science, of medicine, et cetera. And we really need to do something about making sure
Why
that there's...
Why do you think that was and is?
Well, you know, there's a societal issue here, certainly in terms of divisions within the country, but sure. I think we probably, in medicine and science, haven't done a very good job of communicating about the importance of science and medicine and how this really can help the human condition. And so I think this issue of equity and making sure that people have access and the innovations that are coming from science and medicine and biotech, I think we have a really important moral imperative to make sure that they're available to everybody. And that's not just an economic, let's build trust and have communication about it.
What did you learn about the healthcare system? As you mentioned, the vaccine development was historic. It was a frenzy, but there was a lot of public-private partnerships. But what flaws did it expose that policymakers need to address?
So, you know, one of the reasons I went to Flagship Pioneering is because we have a preemptive medicine and health security initiative. So how do we be proactive about creating a health shield to predict what the next pandemic might be, or even if in the context of SARS-CoV-2, what's the next variant we have to be concerned about,
right.
And how do we actually work in a similarly very fast fashion to actually get a vaccine or other treatments for that variant. So really anticipating, and the data are available, and we live in an era where if we can analyze the data and use it and turn it into therapeutics, vaccines, et cetera, it could really work. But the thing that struck me, and now the papers are coming out about this in the literature, the one underlying factor that seems to be the most important in terms of COVID and mortality is chronic disease, obesity being a big one. And so if you think about the challenges facing healthcare in this country and the world, frankly, it's chronic disease. We're heading toward a cliff in terms of the number of people with chronic diseases. So how do we actually identify chronic diseases before they develop and then intervene? Similar to what we do now with cardiovascular disease, identification of hypertension early that's asymptomatic, and cholesterol. So let's do that for cancer. Let's do that for Parkinson's. Let's do that for Alzheimer's and obesity.
Can it be done?
Sure. If we can put together a vaccine and have it authorized in 10 months, we can figure out what the factors are associated with chronic disease and intervene early. It's certainly within our power. I think the data are available for us to analyze and to start thinking about what are those biomarkers, surrogate markers, et cetera, that allow us to predict who's going to develop certain diseases and then develop interventions.
Have you seen that the trust between stakeholders, like government, the government policymakers, as well as outside companies, has improved post-COVID? Because there's always the friction there sometimes.
Yeah, there's a necessary tension, I think, having sat in the regulator seat and now being on the other side of the table. Right. I think that tension can be good. I think what we're seeing in terms of the PDUFA 7, the user fee negotiations with pharma now, there's also a real call for transparency and dialogue between regulators, public health officials, and industry. I think that's a really good trend. I think we need to see more of it. So appropriate oversight, but real transparency about what's required to develop innovations in a safe and effective manner.
When you were dealing with this bizarre virus, was there anything that you thought, well, in the future we need to have more resources devoted to that, and that's what we need to prevent the next one?
So a couple things. One is a basic infrastructure around information gathering and collection, and information dissemination. So I'm thinking back to the task force times, and we literally set up a bank of telephones for folks to call hospitals around the country. I mean, this is 2020. Mm-hmm. And even at the agency, we had folks on the phone 24/7 calling, suppliers of, API, of pharmaceutical precursors in China, in India, et cetera, to make sure that they were available for essential medications. I think we need to really revise and revamp the infrastructure around information gathering and information dissemination. So that would be one. And of course, like in any medical emergency, information dissemination is really important. The other thing is what I already mentioned, which is I think we really need to address the chronic healthcare issues. I'm a cancer doctor, and so I'm really focused on that now. And I truly believe that we're going to be able to identify cancer before it's visible and really intervene and turn it into a disease, not to be feared, but to identify and treat early and cure.
And how long do you think that is off, the cure?
Yeah. Well, it took us 50 years to identify from the Framingham study hypertension, diabetes, cholesterol for cardiovascular disease, and then effective therapies. That was a 50-year journey. It can't take us that long. So we need to get industry, regulators, the medical community together to figure out how to do that. So my crystal ball was never very good being a lung cancer doctor, but I'll tell you, I think we should do this in the next 10 to 20 years.
Where are we with COVID? Is it going to be with us for 2 to 5 to 10 years?
Well, one of your next speakers is probably much better able to predict that, but from what we've seen in terms of the predictions so far and where we are right now, I think this is with us for some time. 2 to 5 years is reasonable. Maybe it's like the flu. It'll be here for ever, and we just have to accept the fact that variants will occur, and we need to address those variants. So it's not going away. The variants occur. We know at the 8.5 right now that we've seen a significant spike around the world. Let's learn to live with this and do it safely. And just one point, again, being a cancer doctor, what we really have to do is to figure out how to protect the most vulnerable among us. Those because of socioeconomic conditions, but also because of chronic diseases. That's a nut we need to crack.
What's your expert opinion on long COVID? It seems like that has triggered a lot more concern, a lot more cases that we've seen that people who've gotten it have gotten this long COVID, which is very concerning.
Yeah, it is very concerning, and it's real. I believe it to be real, and we sort of have to deal with it as a real illness. If you think about other viral illnesses, EBV, sometimes flu, but EBV and other Epstein-Barr virus and other viruses, a prolonged syndrome afterward does occur. So I think it's part of that same pattern. It seems to have effect brain, heart, musculoskeletal system, and we need good research and actually good information and data about the natural history of it to help us intervene. So what are the sort of biomarkers and other risk factors associated with it, and then let's develop the therapeutics to treat it.
As far as investing, where do you think the government should invest? Because a lot of people were, you look at the investment of trying to prevent something like Ebola, and that was in the headlines for a while, and it's kind of back again. But where do you think that the government needs to invest, whether it's in agencies or in public-private partnerships, to encourage innovation, to make sure the patients, all of them, get it?
Yeah, well, first of all, in terms of making sure everybody gets it, really important issue. And I think it would be very reasonable for the government to create programs around increasing access. So how do we incent the private sector to make sure that not only are innovations available to those most in need and those who don't have access, but how do we ensure that they're part of the process, because we spoke about trust, of actually creating those innovations, so clinical trial diversity, et cetera. So really incent the private sector to do that, and I think if those incentives are in place, it will happen. The other thing is, I mentioned the informatics, how do we collect data and disseminate it? And then I feel strongly about the fact that one of the key factors for identification of chronic disease before it comes is a shift in our mindset around the regulatory framework. So how do we actually allow those therapies and identification of pre-disease to flourish? And that's going to require a shift in how we do things. And we saw with the recent aducanumab decision with FDA and the use of surrogate endpoints of biomarkers that that's controversial. So let's get together and figure out what is the appropriate science that allows us to do that identification and then intervene early for these diseases.
As you mentioned, there's been a polarization of the country, and healthcare in particular is certainly partisan. But when you look at the track of Medicare, policymakers are going to have to come together and get some type of bipartisan compromise, like the Balanced Budget Act of 1997. Are you concerned about that, the sustainability of Medicare and also the workforce with an aging population?
Well, your most recent guest president of the AMA really spoke to some of the issues that colleagues and friends in the front line are seeing, and I'm very worried about that. The profession is just too important for us. I think all of us need to say that it's not acceptable that healthcare has become a partisan issue. That this is something that everybody needs and deserves, that access is really important, and that we're all in this together. If we didn't learn that we were all in this together from COVID,
right,
then we're never going to learn this lesson. So I think it's really important that we stop that and say, this isn't partisan. Let's think of ways that we can bridge the gaps that we have to actually develop solutions. So the FDA user reauthorization bill that was just approved in the House of Representatives, great example of a bipartisan effort to try to bring together for public health efforts. We can do it. We just have to start having some conversations.
And to be fair, there have been, as you mentioned, bipartisan healthcare bills. The Cures Act a few years ago was a big bipartisan effort,
yep.
And was hailed as such. So
Operation Warp Speed, Cures,
yes,
et cetera. I mean, it was a great example of what we can do when we get together around a common goal.
It has to be a little more common, I think. Dr. Stephen Hahn, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.